They say that the early 90s was a magical time for gaming, when developers were pushing old hardware to its absolute limits. But even among the many innovators of that era, one game stood head and shoulders above the rest, a mind-bending, genre-blending masterpiece that left gamers scratching their heads and asking, how did they do that on a 16-bit system? I'm talking of course about the 1992 cult classic Flashback. This cinematic side-scroller from French developers Delphine Software didn't just dazzle players with its stunning rotoscoped animation and atmospheric sci-fi world. Flashback went a step further, transcending what a typical platformer could be. Blending exploration, puzzle solving and white-knuckle action sequences, it crafted an experience that simply shouldn't have been possible on machines like the Amiga. Yet against all odds, Delphine delivered a game that felt light years ahead of its time. So grab your holocube and deployable force field, because we're going to explore the making of this ambitious cult favourite. How did a small French studio create one of the most cinematic and technically impressive platformers ever made? What inspired their boundary-pushing vision, and why does Flashback's legacy still loom large over the games that we play today? Let's start at the beginning. In the early 1990s, the small French studio Delphine Software had a reputation for punching well above their weight class with technically impressive games, such as Future Wars and Another World. They were also responsible for the outstanding point-and-click adventure Operation Stealth, and although they were not kicking down graphical doors, it was still one of the best games around in its genre. But with Flashback, they had ambitions that went far beyond just showing off their coding prowess. The game's designer, Paul Cuisset, had a vision: to create a cinematic, story-driven experience that would transport players to the far future in a way they had never seen before, and to pull it off, he turned to some unlikely sources of inspiration. On the gameplay front, Cuisset looked to hits like Prince of Persia, marvelling at their smooth, rotoscoped character animations that seemed to defy the limitations of 16-bit hardware. If Flashback could capture even a fraction of that fluid movement, it would already be a visual tour de force. But Cuisset didn't just want a pretty platformer. He craved atmosphere, mood, a full-fledged sci-fi world that would suck players in from the opening frames. For that, he looked to horror and sci-fi film classics like Alien, Blade Runner and Total Recall. Combining those inspirations into a cohesive whole wouldn't be easy, but Delphine had a secret weapon in their arsenal: rotoscoping. The tried and true technique of tracing over live action footage frame by frame. It was a painstaking process, but one that could theoretically capture realistic movement and cinematic camera work. Rather than the standard rotoscoping process, Delphine employed a more complex method, specifically for Flashback. Live video was first traced into transparencies, which were then used to animate the character movements. This labour-intensive approach paid off with incredibly lifelike cinematic motion that elevated Flashback's visuals. Flashback's roots can be traced back to a Hollywood gem. In a chat with Retro Gamer back in 2013, Paul Cuisset, the brains behind the game, spoke to the magazine on its original concept: an adaptation of The Godfather. Cuisset recalled how US Gold, the publisher, approached Delphine and tossed them the idea of creating a game. Their pitch was a futuristic twist on The Godfather, set in space. Now, it's worth noting that early game adaptations often took liberties with their source material. Delphine Software, already familiar with adapting blockbuster movies into games, had previously worked on Operation Stealth, a game inspired by the James Bond franchise. Due to licensing issues, James Bond became Mr. Glames outside of the United States, and the game took players on a globe-trotting adventure with a spy who oddly received orders from the CIA, despite being MI6 affiliated. So, back to the Godfather game concept. The plan? To transport Michael Corleone's tale into the future, where he'd be on the run from futuristic mobsters instead of dodging cyborg cops. Imagine Corleone not as a young scientist fleeing high-tech law enforcement, but as a fugitive escaping mafia hitmen in a sci-fi setting. The initial demo alone chewed up 6 to 7 months of development time. But alas, US Gold eventually pulled the plug on the project. Perhaps it veered a bit too far off course in a few spots. Cuisette took the reins and reimagined the storyline, preserving the game's core while drawing inspiration from a smorgasbord of cinematic influences. Flashback is a love letter to the sci-fi genre, weaving together nods to countless classics. Picture it as a tapestry of retro sci-fi action cinema. Our protagonist awakens on a lush jungle planet, his memory a blank slate. Soon he stumbles upon a holocube, a nifty gadget that plays a holographic message recorded back on Earth. In the hologram, his past self, addressing him as Conrad, urges him to track down his buddy Ian in New Washington. Sound familiar? Well, it's a nod to that iconic scene from Total Recall, where amnesiac Quaid receives instructions from his former self via a video recording. Once Conrad tracks down Ian, he settles into a clunky metallic chair, ready to have his lost memories restored. It's a scene reminiscent of Total Recall, though here it's all about implanting real memories and not the supposed artificial kind. As Conrad delves into his past, he uncovers a mind-bending revelation. He's a mastermind behind a groundbreaking invention, high-tech glasses capable of detecting molecular density. These specs unveil aliens masquerading as humans right here on Earth. It's a setup reminiscent of John Carpenter's cult classic They Live, where a wandering protagonist discovers extraterrestrial infiltrators hiding in plain sight through special shades. But Conrad isn't your average wanderer. He's a scientist with a heroic streak. In this vein, he's more akin to Buckaroo Banzai, the beloved 80s action hero who effortlessly blended dashing heroism with the smarts of a neurosurgeon and inventor. Banzai's ingenuity knows no bounds. He crafts a device capable of piercing through solid matter, but when he tests it out, he accidentally unveils a startling truth: reptilian humanoids hiding in plain sight among Earth's populace. It's like a scene straight out of Flashback's cover art, with those eerie aliens lurking in the shadows. In the game, these creatures are known as morphs, fittingly named for their ability to shapeshift into any form they desire. They're not just masters of the skies, they can even transform into a sentient primordial goo, a discovery that Conrad stumbles upon during his journey to their home planet. This shape-shifting behaviour brings to mind the liquid metal T-1000 from Terminator 2 Judgment Day, a nod to classic sci-fi cinema. And what do these aliens want? Well, they've got their sights set on taking over Earth, as any self-respecting extraterrestrial invader would. But fear not, because Conrad's on the case, ready to thwart their plans by, you guessed it, blowing up their home planet. Accompanying Flashback's release in the States was an exciting Marvel comic, bundled with the Genesis, Super Nintendo and Sega CD versions of the game. This comic served as a prelude to the main event, offering fans a deeper dive into the world of Flashback. Let's take a wee look at the comic's cover. A vibrant explosion of neon pink, blue and yellow hues, instantly transporting you back to the 80s. Now, let's talk aesthetics. In the comic, Conrad cuts a striking figure, with a physique that screams action hero and a rugged handsomeness to match. It's a far cry from the game's portrayal, where Conrad sports more of a Marty McFly vibe, a cool everyman rather than a glorified hero. Granted, technical limitations might play a part in this disparity, but hey, it's all part of the charm. Flashback's levels are like mini masterpieces, each one a rich tapestry woven with threads of the finest science fiction cinema. You can practically smell the nostalgia as you dive into each stage, with nods to classic movies peppered throughout. Take a peek at the jukebox and you'll find yourself humming along to tunes like The Running Man and Escape to New Washington. These are clear nods to Schwarzenegger's classic like The Running Man and Carpenter's Escape from New York. It's as if the game is wearing its influences proudly on its sleeve, giving a respectful nod to the films that inspired it. And speaking of inspiration, it's no secret that Arnold Schwarzenegger movies played a starring role in shaping Flashback's world. Just take the first level, where Conrad finds himself stranded in a mysterious alien jungle teeming with hostile mutant creatures. Sound familiar? It's like a homage to the intense jungle setting of Predator, complete with lurking dangers and a sense of foreboding around every corner. Beneath the dense canopy of the alien jungle lies the bustling metropolis of New Washington, a city thriving deep underground. It's a stark contrast to the lush greenery above, a hidden world where humanity has carved out its existence in the shadows. The social dynamics of Titan are a twist on the classic tale of the time machine, where eerie troglodyte creatures dwell beneath the surface, while the surface world remains tranquil. Here, the opposite. Life flourishes below ground, while the surface remains a mystery. As you wander the neon-lit streets of New Washington, you can't help but feel a sense of déjà vu. The cityscape is a love letter to Blade Runner, and its angular vehicles, weathered walls and towering metal grey structures dominate the skyline. It's a dystopian dream, reminiscent of the gritty streets of futuristic LA in Ridley Scott's iconic film. In New Washington, corruption runs rampant, with rogue cyborgs lurking in shadowy alleys and renegade cops enforcing their own brand of justice under the glow of neon signs. It's a world where danger lurks around every corner, and trust is a luxury few can afford. In Flashback, Conrad isn't just a one-trick pony. He's a man of many talents. Within the gritty confines of New Washington, he can pick up a variety of odd jobs, making the game one of the pioneers in incorporating job mechanics into gameplay. It's a neat little touch that adds depth to Conrad's journey, allowing players to explore different facets of his character while navigating the city's treacherous streets. The second level is where things really start to get interesting. Here, Conrad finds himself in the Death Tower, a chilling nod to the Running Man. It's here that he must compete in a high-stakes game show, where survival is the name of the game, and victory means earning his ticket back to Earth. But the adventure doesn't stop there. As Conrad ventures deeper into the unknown, he finds himself on a morph planet, a surreal landscape filled with otherworldly architecture straight out of a sci-fi fever dream. Picture the eerie alien hive from Aliens, but with a twist. Instead of ominous shadows and dark corridors, Morph Planet is bathed in vibrant pinks and purples, reminiscent of the psychedelic covers of 70s science fiction paperbacks. It's a bold design choice that perfectly captures the game's unapologetic embrace of its inspirations. Flashback isn't just a feast for the eyes, it's a symphony for the ears too. And there's a fascinating backstory behind its stellar sound design. Enter Jean Baudelot, the mastermind behind the game's unforgettable music. Before diving into the world of video game composition, Baudelot made a name for himself at Delphine Records, a French record company known for its instrumental tunes. His bread and butter? Crafting catchy jingles for TV and radio commercials. But here's where things get interesting. According to Cusette, it was Baudelot's brainchild to launch Delphine Software, the gaming arm of the company. You see, Baudelot was a big fan of the music that you could create on the Amiga's Soundtracker software, so he set out to create a company dedicated to bringing that magic to life in video games, and thus Delphine Software was born. With Baudelot at the helm, it's no wonder Flashback's soundtrack is top-notch, matching the visual splendour of the game pixel for pixel. It's a testament to his passion for crafting unforgettable melodies and his vision for pushing the boundaries of what video game music could achieve. Interesting note is that the record label Delphine Records was first launched in 1974 by Paul de Seinville alongside Olivier Toussaint. The company was named after de Seinville's first child called, you guessed it, Delphine. As we touched on at the start of this video, Flashback's genius lies in its ability to push the boundaries of technology, even with the limitations of the time. Take for instance its groundbreaking rotoscoped animation, a technique inspired by the original Prince of Persia game. This innovation allowed for some of the most realistic and fluid movement ever seen in a video game up to that point, running at a silky smooth 24 frames per second, the same frame rate as cinematic films. Flashback's animation still holds up beautifully today. Sure, the cutscenes, painstakingly crafted frame by frame using polygons, might show a few rough edges here and there, but hey, there's no denying the overall impact of the game's hand-drawn backdrops and lifelike animation. And the numbers, well, they speak for themselves. Flashback was a bona fide hit, selling over 750,000 copies in France alone and earning a coveted spot in the Guinness World Records as the best-selling French game of all time. Much of its success can be attributed to its impressive technical prowess and artistry, proving that sometimes limitations can be the mother of innovation. Of course, no retrospective on a classic game's development would be complete without discussing the harrowing challenge of getting said masterpiece to run on other platforms. For Flashback, that quest proved, well, let's go with interesting. While the Amiga version dazzled with its technical bravado, trying to cram that cinematic extravagance into restrictive 16-bit consoles like the Genesis, Mega Drive and Super Nintendo was a bit like squeezing Ed 209 into a pair of skinny jeans. Compromises, both hilarious and tragic, had to be made. On the Sega Genesis front, Delphine basically had to make Flashback look like it went through the frosted glass treatment, with environments descending into an impressionistic blurriness. Fans likened it to the game being constantly out of focus, which is certainly one way to create an atmospheric experience. But at least those blurry backgrounds maintained most of Flashback's foreboding industrial aesthetic. The Super Nintendo port, on the other hand, opted for a more, shall we say, clean look, replacing the gritty sci-fi hallways with cheerful pastels straight out of a romper room fever dream. It's like an alien crash landed into Krusty's playhouse. Performance took a hit too across both console versions, with slowdown and chuggy animation making Conrad's usually fluid motion look more like a drunken mall Santa. Not quite the height of cinematic immersion. To the game's credit though, the core gameplay still shone through despite the technical downgrades, a testament to just how ahead of its time the original design was. But if porting hassles taught Delphine Software one harsh lesson, it's that their ambitiously cinematic vision was perhaps too boundary pushing for the 16-bit hardware of the day, at least outside the comparatively beefy Amiga, an unfortunate side effect of being ahead of the curve. Still, seeing a studio dream so deliriously big, technical limitations be damned, made the porting nightmares almost worth it for a glimpse at such unbridled ambition, even if it gave us the occasional blurry or pastel-coated reminder that art must bend to reality eventually. By now it should be clear that Flashback wasn't just another cult classic, it was a game that boldly challenged our assumptions about what was possible on the systems at the time. In 1995, Delphine Software released the official sequel Fade to Black, which translated Flashback's cinematic platforming into a new 3D engine and gameplay perspective. While retaining the atmospheric sci-fi storytelling, Fade to Black attempted to blend exploration and puzzle elements with real-time combat and abilities like cloaking. However, the transition to 3D was a mixed bag, with critics praising the improved graphics and cinematic vision, but finding the gameplay overall less compelling than its 2D predecessor. Still, it carried on Delphine's pioneering spirit of genre mashups. The Flashback story looked to continue in 2003 with Flashback Legend, with both Delphine and publisher Adeline Software working on the project, but those plans were ultimately shelved when Delphine went bankrupt later that year. It wasn't until 2013 that Flashback was revived, first with a crowd-funded remastered classic edition handled by Boxed Dream and original creator Paul Cussette. This updated version featured higher resolution graphics while retaining the old school gameplay intact. Then, in 2022, Microids released Flashback 2, an official sequel over 2 decades in the making. Acting as a surprising prequel set 8 years before the original, it retained the classic side-scroller action while incorporating new gameplay twists, like playable VR hacking sequences. Reviews praised Flashback 2's visual overhaul and engaging puzzles, though some felt it couldn't entirely recapture the magic of the first game's tightly designed action. Regardless, it proved there was still an audience hungry to experience Conrad's cyberpunk world in a modern guise. So while Flashback's original boundary-pushing production was very much a product of its 16-bit era's technical limitations, the franchise's spirit of innovation has lived on through remasters and sequels striving to reinvent that cinematic sci-fi core for new generations. Through inspired technical trickery and relentless ambition, Delphine Software crafted an atmospheric sci-fi adventure that felt beamed in from the future. From the moment Conrad's amnesia-addled mug appeared on the screen, players knew they were in for something special. Flashback's liquid smooth character animations, cinematic camera work, and intricately rendered environments had an undeniable wow factor. But beyond just dazzling with its futuristic veneers, the game's finely tuned platforming gameplay and seamless narrative storytelling made for an experience that consistently surprised and delighted. One minute you're solving environmental puzzles, the next you're blasting alien mutants or outrunning bodacious bodyguards straight out of a James Bond movie. So while nostalgia can admittedly cloud our memories of old favourites, Trust me when I say that Flashback absolutely merits a rediscovery or revisit if you haven't already experienced its delirious cyberpunk splendours. It's a masterclass in fusing cutting-edge tech with bold creative visions, a showcase of what gaming's interactive power could achieve in the right directorial hands. Just don't blame me if the occasional bout of slowdown or oddly resplendent colour palette reminds you that perfection was never quite an option on those ancient 16-bit machines. Hey, when you're shooting for the stars, a few rough edge landings are par for the course. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go and fire up the old Amiga emulator. Conrad's inevitable swagger down an atmospheric futuristic corridor is calling my name once again. I'm Bitmap Jack, and if you've got this far, I just want to say thanks ever so much for listening to me waffle on. Take care of yourselves, and remember, up, up, down, down, left, right, BA.